Well, welcome to episode 164 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. This time we're going to talk about Burning Spear's third album, the first album to really hit big internationally, which is Marcus Garvey. And what I have here is not the original Jamaican mix, and that actually matters, as I discovered when I was doing the research for this particular review. And so much so, in fact, that it prompted me to seek out the original release, which I'll review at some point. At their peak in the 1970s, Burning Spear recorded some of the most compelling, political, powerful, melodic reggae music in the whole roots reggae catalog. This album was very much from that era, and it's arguably Burning Spear's best record. So any conversation about Burning Spear starts and finishes with Winston Rodney, who was born in 1945 in Jamaica in St. Anne, which is also where Bob Marley hails from. Growing up, he had two great interests, which of course would dovetail in his musical career. The first was that he loved American music, he loved R&B, he loved the music of Otis Redding, of James Brown, and so on. But he was also highly politically conscious from an early age, and he was extremely aware of Jamaica's situation as a colonized country, as a country effectively under white rule, where the poor and the working class were black, and the people basically living high off the hog were the British colonists. As such, he was deeply influenced by Marcus Garvey, the early 20th century Pan-Africanist and philosopher of black self-determination. Garvey is deservedly a hero in Jamaica and elsewhere, and his ideas continue to influence black liberation movements all the way through the 20th century, the Nation of Islam, the Black Power movement, and Rastafari. In fact, one of the key pieces of Rastafarian belief, the divine status of Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, stems directly from a Garvey prophecy: look to Africa when a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is near. In the late 1960s, Rodney, who has a budding singing career in Kingston, forms a duo with Rupert Willington. They name themselves Burning Spear after an award given out by Jomo Kenyatta, who was the first elected leader of Kenya after independence and who, parenthetically, is the great uncle of Rage Against the Machine's Tom Morello. Rodney knew Bob Marley, so he approached him and said, well, how can we get a deal? How can we get a foothold here? And Marley says, well, why don't you go and talk to Cox and Dodd at Studio One? So Cox and Dodd is an absolutely legendary figure in the development of reggae and ska music in the 60s and 70s in Jamaica. As a young person, he'd had the opportunity to travel to the American South, where he listened to all kinds of R&B records. He comes back from America laden with all kinds of R&B records and starts a little R&B craze in Jamaica. He does so by setting up a sound system called Downbeat Sound System. Now, sound systems in Jamaica were effectively, in the 50s and 60s, kind of the equivalent of nightclubs, certainly in the poorer neighborhoods of Kingston, mounted on a truck or a van or something like that, and would drive around basically to certain locations where you have an impromptu party. That was how records got played. That was the equivalent of underground radio. That was the way that most Jamaicans heard their cutting-edge music and the biggest hits of the day. Cox and Dodd pretty soon became the supremo of all the operators of these sound systems. He actually had 5 of them, and his DJs included people like U-Roy, Prince Buster, and Lee Scratch Perry, who of course would go on to an enormous career as a producer later on in the 60s and 70s. In 1963, what would be a really momentous development for the future, what would become reggae, he opens Studio One, which was the first black-owned studio and label in Jamaica. As such, he had much closer access to some of the greatest acts and people who would go on to be legendary in ska and reggae. People like the Scatolites, Toots and the Maytals, Horace Andy, a whole bunch of folks. And those classic old Studio One releases, the original pressings from the 60s and 70s, are incredibly hard to find, but they're absolute gold if you can. In any event, in 1969, Rodney and Willington, now known as Burning Spear, auditioned for Dodd, and that audition leads to the release of their very first single called Door Peep. They then added a third singer, Delroy Hines, and recorded a bunch more singles and a couple of albums for Dodd. Being signed by Studio One was a good break, but the trouble was, at this point, because Dodd was such a kingmaker, it was a bit controlling as a situation to be in. So in 1975, they left Studio One and went to work with a different producer, a guy called Lawrence Lindo, better known by his nickname, Jack Ruby. Their very first session with him at his studio in Oco Rios yields a huge hit, Marcus Garvey, and that's followed up by another very successful song, Slavery Days, and on the back of all that success, they go back into the studio to make the rest of this record. So this record was made by the classic, if short-lived, lineup of Burning Spear, which of course features Winston Rodney on lead vocals and Delroy Hines and Rupert Willington, who together provide the harmonies. It's a wickedly good session and produces a whole bunch of classic songs, and that has a lot to do with the fact that in addition to the 3 singers, Ruby was able to draft in a whole bunch of basically all-star musicians from across the reggae scene in Jamaica. These include Tyrone Downey on piano and organ, the famous Robbie Shakespeare, well, he would be famous at some point, on bass, another bassist, Bob Marley's bass player, Aston Family Man Barrett, and on the drums, somebody who I think kind of got the short end of the stick when it came to reggae nicknames, Leroy Horsemouth Wallace. The Jamaican release of this album in the spring of 1975 is a big seller, and that attracts the attention of the real heavyweights at this point on the Jamaican record production scene, and that was Chris Blackwell's Island Records. Blackwell, who of course was the guy who'd taken Jimmy Cliff, Bob Marley, Toots and the Maytals, all of those bands, taken them international, approached Burning Spear and said, let's do an international release. And that was kind of a hard offer for anybody to refuse. True to form, the album is a big success internationally, makes lots of headway in the United States market, and is well reviewed. And this really sets up the band. But, and there is a but, what had happened was that Island had remixed the album in the process to make it, and this is kind of inexplicable to me, but it is what it is, to make it more accessible to a white audience. They sped up some of the songs, which I guess, frankly, had just too much of a groove. They made it a little poppier and lighter sounding. The band were absolutely pissed off with this, and eventually this leads to Winston Rodney forming his own production company so he can have creative control. Side 1 starts with a title track which had already been a hit single in Jamaica for the band, Marcus Garvey, and this is one of the songs which really is altered substantially from what was originally intended by the band. It's faster, it's lighter feeling, it just doesn't have the same oomph, I guess. That said, even in this version, it's an absolutely amazing song, and if I never told you the story, you wouldn't care and you'd think it's fantastic, but trust me, there's an even better version out there. Musically, this is phenomenal. The vocal chemistry between the three singers is fabulous. The instrumentation is great. The playing is great. The stripped down, rootsy feel of the music is something which, it's a special sauce of a lot of records, reggae records in the 1970s that were really down to the beautifully present, simple sound, which is just so compelling. Lyrically, this is all about hailing Marcus Garvey for the fact that his prophecy that a king would be crowned in Africa, a black king, has come to pass. Now, of course, what's happened at the time is that Haile Selassie has died within a year of this record being made. So the subtext to all of this is that there is a big, almost a theological crisis happening in the Rastafari movement, because as a deity, it wasn't held to be possible that Haile Selassie could actually die like a mortal man, which of course he does in 1974. And there is an enormous bunch of soul searching which goes on. This song has a highly kind of religious and political and immediate context in Jamaican society when it's released at the time, because it refers specifically to this prophecy of Haile Selassie. And one of the greatest 1-2 punches of any record, the next song is Slavery Days. My favorite part about this song too are those wonderful horns, which has so much color and texture to the music. Next song, The Invasion, is really actually about theft of people from Africa to become slaves, but also theft of culture. And the chanted word wadada, which occurs all the way through the song, is a reference to the missing love and decency, respect, and kindness, and the fact that culture is continually being stolen and rights and identity are continually being trampled in Jamaica. The rest of side 1 includes Live Good, which is notable for having this really cool flute piece, which is kind of an unusual instrumentation in reggae. And the side concludes with Give Me, which is a pretty clear demand for the end of white control. Side 2 starts with Old Marcus Garvey, a very cool song, a very historical song, lamenting the failure of Jamaicans in the present day to remember who their historical political heroes of liberation were. The next song, Tradition, carries on the theme of resisting exploitation. And then we have Jordan River. This is a really cool tune. The guitars have an almost banjo-like feel in the rhythm. It's very infectious. The more spiritual feel continues with Red, Gold, and Green, which starts off with Rodney whispering to you to come and join him by the banks of the river. This song seems very much like a Rasta spiritual. There's lots of references to Haile Selassie being crowned in Ethiopia. And then, of course, there's a significance to the colors red, gold, and green, which were, of course, the same colors used by Marcus Garvey. Red for the bloodshed, yellow for the gold of Africa, and green for the promised land, which the Rastas took to be Ethiopia. The final song, Resting Place, another strong song, completing a set of 10 extremely strong songs in this whole record, is basically an ecological song. It's about pollution and so on. Anyway, that winds up the whole record. This is one of the greatest reggae records ever made, the mix notwithstanding. The contrast of Rodney's chanted lyrics with those sweet harmonies of his bandmates is just like the butter spread across this record. And when you include the political and spiritual content and the genuine feeling and emotion and the quality of the sound of this album, it just doesn't get a lot better than this. He'd get close to this, the band would, and then he would on his own, but he'd never really exceed this. An absolute must for any reggae collection, or really any record collection, and it's a 5 out of 5.